Hi, I'm Graham Blackburn, and this is Traditional Woodworking by Hand. And today's episode is all about the block plane. As I've mentioned before, most woodworking planes belong to one of three families. There are the bench planes that we've talked about, comprised of the smoothing plane, the miter plane, the jointer plane, and several other names. And then there are molding planes that are designed specifically to put a molding or a shape on the edge of a piece of wood. And then there's a third group of planes, which I call special purpose planes, each of which does one particular job. It makes a groove, or it makes a circle, or it makes a dado. But there is actually another group of planes that I don't know whether it could have its own class, but I tend to think of them as being part of the bench planes. And these are the small block planes. They're one-handed, which makes them very convenient. And they come in a variety of different shapes, and we'll talk a little bit about the history um, in a little bit. But I just want to point out the different kinds that you might come across, all of which, by the way, are very useful. Here, this is the Common or Garden Stanley block plane. And as you can see, it's got a nice rounded top to it that makes it easy to hold. And it's got little indentations here to keep your thumb and your finger tight. It's particularly useful to have a small plane like this for small trimming jobs. Take a look at this. If we come over here, and I just want to trim a little bit off here, you can see I can trim nicely there. I could trim at an angle. And by the way, notice that as I'm using this plane, I'm not going straight ahead, as I've mentioned many times before. That presents the entire blade to the wood. I'm going at a bit of an angle, right? So anyway, having a small single-handed block plane is a very useful thing. A little trimming like that, but also one of its other really useful little jobs is if, for example, I'm making mortise and tenons. Now we've done this before, and I've demonstrated how we excavated the part where the tenon goes in the mortise. And if it's a blind mortise and tenon, meaning that it doesn't go all the way through, that it's important when you make the mortise here to try and make it as square as possible. But to guarantee that the tenon that fits in there will fit in perfectly, invariably I take a block plane, whatever block plane is handy, and I will gently, once again holding the plane at a bit of an angle, I will just gently trim off the ends so that the actual corners of the tenon are not perfectly square. Then if this is not perfectly square, this is going to fit. That's just one typical use of the standard block plane. Now let's talk a little bit about some of the varieties that you may come across. This is the contemporary Stanley version. Here is an older version. This is known as the flip top. And you pull the top like this, and it comes off. It comes off here, and you can adjust the blade. You'll notice that pretty much all of these block planes have much lower angled irons than your standard bench planes, which can be typically 45 degrees or what's known as York pitch 50 degrees. And that makes them especially good for planing end grain. So one of the great uses of the block plane is to plane end grain. And you can do that a variety of ways. You could do it using a bench hook, described here, and you can put the plane here, and this will guarantee that what you plane, I can find my little square, will be perfectly square. That's a really nice, neat thing to do. Here's another variety of block plane, and this one you'll notice has an even lower angle, which makes it especially good for planing end grain. Whether I'm planing the end grain using a bench hook like this, or whether I'm perhaps using my shooting board, which in combination with the fact that if I know this is flat and this side is perpendicular, then I will be able to trim the end grain of whatever piece of wood I want, and when I've done it, it will be perfectly square. Here is yet another variety of block plane. This one has the advantage that the iron is already skewed, which, of course, as I've explained many times before, makes it much easier to plane if you don't attack the entire workpiece with the entire width of the blade. But in addition to being skewed and making the planing easier, this plane also has a removable side. So it's just two little screws here. You undo that, and you undo this, and then the side can be removed, and voila, we now have a block plane that will plane right into the corner of something. Look at this over here. Here's a little rabbit in the side of a piece of wood, and I want to clean up and make sure that it fits perfectly. So I can put the plane in here, and I can plane along, and not only do I plane the surface, but I plane right into the corner. If you find one of these, count yourself very lucky. But as I've also mentioned before, in this day and age, finally we have some tool manufacturers who are once again manufacturing high class versions of hand tools. And Lee Nielsen is one of those manufacturers, and they've produced a block plane with a nice low angle, but you'll see that the blade is like a rabbit plane. It goes to both sides. So this would do the same job as this. It would be nice if it were perhaps, angled or tilted, but even so, this plane is also really useful for planing this side of the wood, or I could turn it around and plane this side of the wood. In any event, there are a lot of different model block planes. Having at least one is good. But I want to point out something that happened before Stanley started attempting to duplicate every wooden plane in the world with a metal version. Here is an old 19th century block plane. Now, you might be wondering, why are these called block planes? Well, originally, a block plane was the plane that was designed specifically to plane the end of the pieces of wood that make up butcher block. And I'm sure you know what butcher block is. That's like a surface made up of lots of pieces of wood, and the ends needed to be planed. So this plane, unlike most other bench planes, has a lower angle, and it only has a single iron, but it's especially good if you use it with a shooting board, for example. It's especially good for planing the end of the grain, the side of the grain, like I'm doing here. See how the shavings come out, and if we test it, you can see that it's perfectly square. Or we can plane the end. And don't forget, as I've told you before, when we're using a shooting board, we're not using the table, that's the top part, as a guide. We're usually planing to a line that we've marked so that the workpiece overhangs a little bit. And now we plane across, and that will make whatever this line is, whether it's perfectly perpendicular or whether it's at an angle, it will make it at least perfectly square. So this was one of the original wooden block planes. Here is yet another relatively rare example of a wooden block plane. You notice it has a lower angle iron, and it only has a single iron. And when I found this, the iron is really good quality and I wanted to use it, but it had been used and flattened so many times that I needed to close up the mouth. Because of it, as I've also said in the past, it's not good to have an opening between the blade and the plane that's any thicker than the shaving that you want to take. And that, by the way, is why practically all of these modern metal block planes all have ways of adjusting the mouth. In the Stanley, you simply undo this nut here, and by turning this, it moves. If I turn the plane over, you can see as I turn this, it moves the mouth forward or back. There are different ways of doing that. Here's another example. You loosen this, and then you can turn this, and it will adjust the mouth. Remember, the adjustment of the mouth of a plane is very important, because if the mouth is wider than the thickness of the shaving that you're taking, you run the risk, especially if you're planing against a grain, of tear out. And we don't want dreaded tear out. Ideally, almost any plane in the world is designed essentially to be able to plane any piece of wood in any direction. So there we've covered a whole bunch of block planes. But I want to point out one last thing. Here, this is a 19th century block plane, and that was originally designed with a low angle and a very tight mouth and very nicely flat and perpendicular soles, infilled so it would stay the same shape. This was the plane that was also designed to plane butcher block, and it kind of is the ancestor of today's modern mitre plane. This is a Lie-Nielsen plane, and it also is very square and very adjustable. You can adjust the mouth, and this is the plane that works best of all if you're wanting to straighten the side of the piece of wood. Very easy, takes a shaving, and I know that this edge here is going to be perfectly square, right? So there's a brief introduction to block planes. There are many, many more examples of block planes than I can possibly tell you in these few minutes that we do these episodes for. So I wanted to point out one of the books, one of the many books that I've written. And this is actually now called Volume 1, and it's a dictionary, an alphabetical encyclopedia of all the hand tools. And the section on planes is one of the largest sections in the whole book. And if you're interested, you can read about block planes, and you can read about bench planes, and you can read about circular planes, and you can read about planes forever. So by all means, feel free to go to my website, which is blackburnbooks.com, and that's where you can find all the books that I've written, and you can order them directly from the website. You can call me up, you can email me, and I think many of these books will be a useful addition to your library, just as I hope that these little classes will also help. So if you like that, please remember, if you haven't already, to subscribe. By all means, send me questions. I enjoy answering your comments and helping you out with different things. And come back next time, and we're going to start using some of these tools now to actually make some good examples of little bits of furniture. So thank you very much for watching. Enjoy your woodworking.